Right. So welcome everyone to this, our third in the series of CAWASA webinars for 2024. And today our special guest hails from Canada in the Pembina Valley Water Cooperative. He's the former CEO and had spent quite a bit of time there um, with where he was involved in providing leadership for operations of water treatment plants and a 9,000 square kilometer distribution system serving domestic business and the agricultural sector needs. Prior to that, he worked in the manufacturing sector for over 35 years in operations, maintenance, and engineering roles. He provided executive leadership to several companies with international sales, such as Procter & Gamble, Weyerhaeuser, and Schultz. He served as a utility manager at a pulp mill for several years. And currently, he is providing part-time coaching as an executive leadership advisor for business owners in southern Manitoba, as offered by the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Organization. He has served for 6 years as a Manitoba board member on the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association, and 4 years as their secretary-treasurer. While with the CWWA, that is the CWW of Canada, he led a committee to develop a workforce development guidance document for use by utilities across Canada. He has also served for 6 years as an executive board member for the Red River Basin Commission, which focuses on water issues between the United States and Canada. He chaired a committee whose mandate was to work on drought planning and mitigation with government representatives from the United States and Canada. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Acadia University, a Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering from Technical University of Nova Scotia, and a Master of Business Administration from Athabasca University. And he has been around the Caribbean, but not to many of some of the islands represented this afternoon. But he is from the coastal state, so he loves the sea as well. So I have great pleasure in welcoming Mr. Greg Archibald, and who is also now a member of the Operators Without Borders. And we would like to thank Valerie Jenkinson for finding him for us this afternoon. Welcome on board, Greg.
Thank you very much, Ignatius. And thank you everyone for joining me this afternoon and for allowing me to share some of my learnings about our drought journey in southern Manitoba. What I would like to do is share kind of it in 3 different pieces. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Pembina Valley Water Co-op, which is the utility I worked with in southern Manitoba. So that'll just help set the stage. Then I'm going to tell you about what we did establishing a drought program. We actually put together a detailed drought plan in terms of how we would do that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that process and how we work through it. And then we got our drought plan together, and all of a sudden we had a real drought. And so I'm going to talk about the actual implementation, what we learned, and how that worked. It's one thing to spend your time putting together a plan and hope that you never have a disaster, but it's quite another thing when you get hit with it. So that's what this afternoon is about, so sharing. So I'll go ahead and share some stuff. I'd encourage you, we're going to have question and answer at the end. So I'd encourage you, if you got questions, just jot them down on the side. And when we get to the end, I'm more than willing to share what it was like and answer individual questions. So let's go ahead here and talk a little bit about, as I said, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the background. Pembina Valley Water Co-op, and we call that PVWC. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to speak to it as PVWC. And it came about all back in the 90s when a bunch of municipalities, areas in southern Manitoba said we need a regional approach to providing water. And we don't have a distribution system, and we have a drought-prone area. And so what are we going to do about it? And so that was kind of the incentive at the start. Now, the water co-op, or PVWC, I'm going to go backwards from the bottom up on this slide and talk about it a little bit. Our water sources are two things. One is the Red River, and the Red River is curious because it starts in South Dakota, runs north through North Dakota, runs into Manitoba, into the Hudson Bay, and into the Arctic. So it's a little unusual in that you've got a river that runs north. And so some of the issues we have, our partners on the other side of the US border have some of the same issues. So that's one of our main water sources is the Red River. And the other source is what we call Stephenfield Lake, which is a lake kind of inland in the prairie. It's filled by runoff off an escarpment to the side. And so it has some, allows us to provide a water system. And as Ignatius mentioned, our total area is 9,000 square kilometers, or 3,474. I'm not sure the different jurisdictions in the Caribbean, but in Canada, we're officially metric, and we mix metric and English all the time on everything we do. So hopefully I don't cause anybody any grief if I jump back and forth between metric and English, and that's just kind of the way it's evolved in Canada. Our one of our big differences for some of the traditional domestic potable water supply is that 30% of our water goes to ag sector. Specifically, it goes to crop spraying. So you can see that picture at the top. On the prairies where I come from, there's an extensive amount of herbicides used to kill weeds and to promote the crop growing. And so this is mixed up with water. And so there's an extensive amount of water used in the ag sector for crop spraying, but also for drinking water for pigs, chickens, and cattle in the ag sector. So when you look at the top and you say we serve 62,000 people, you say, well, that's not that many. But then you look at the bottom and you say, ooh, 30% of our product on top of that, what would be going to the people, go to ag and some industrials. So you can see there, we serve 14 members. The 14 different municipalities own the PVWC. And so we supply water to towns, cities, and rural municipalities that are smaller. We supply water to 4 private water co-ops. We supply water to 1 First Nation community. And so that gives you just a little bit of background. And you can see up on the top of the slide there, you can see that picture of Canada. And then jumped out at you, you can see the picture of Manitoba. And right at the bottom of Manitoba is where I am. I can almost see the US border from my house. And so that gives you a perspective. The 14 municipalities are across that southern part of Manitoba. So now a little bit more about Pembina Valley Water Co-op, or PVWC. It was mentioned in the introduction that we have a number of water treatment plants. So we just deal with the water supply. The waste treatment is on a smaller scale, dealt with the individual municipalities. But we have what we call our Letellier, our Morris, and our Stephenfield. So you can see some pictures of the water treatment plants here. Of note, the one in Morris, bottom 2 in the overhead, these particular ones are membrane plants. So you notice the 2 pictures here. One is the MFs, or the microfilters, the one up in the middle there, and then the ROs over on the side. And both the 2 plants across the bottom both use that. You can see at the Stephenville one, you can see the lake in the background as the water source. The other thing is the one that's called the Letellier one is a traditional cold lime softening plant. So it's a different kind of water source. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea about what we're about. And finally, just one more picture to give you a little more on the background. This just gives you the feeding areas, if you will, between the different plants. So you can see where it shows Morris and Letellier. That's the Red River running right up along there. And Letellier feeds a certain area, Morris feeds a certain area, and the Stephenfield area feeds a certain area. We have a reservoir at Roland in the middle, and then the whole system is tied together in a few places. So in terms of pipelines, our main pipelines, and these are the pipelines, our big ones, 186 miles. But then there's literally, I don't know, almost thousands of a lot of miles of pipeline that's owned by each of the individual municipalities through the towns, the cities, and the smaller rural communities. We have 16 major booster stations. As I said, we have the 3 water treatment plants, and we have a large regional reservoir stuck underground that just helps us allocate things. So this just gives you a picture when we talk about a water co-op. What are we talking about? So let's just get into this process of talking about drought planning and what did we do. So talk about what I think and what we ended up with, the key parts of our drought plan. And so you can see them listed there: monitoring, mitigation, response, preparedness, and recovery. You'll notice up on the top, this is a plug for AWWA. They have a nice manual that talks about how to put together a detailed plan. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes, is us putting together a detailed plan about what would we do and how would we get ready for a drought situation, and then writing it all down, documenting it, getting all of our 14 municipalities aligned so that everybody is ready to go if we do get hit with a drought. And it turns out we did get hit with a drought. So I'll be able to give you, so how did it go? So first, I'm going to talk about what needs to be in a plan. And certainly at the end, these are the detailed plan is probably, I don't know, 50 pages with appendices and graphs and other things. And it's available electronically if anybody is looking for it, either through Ignatius or Valerie. I could make it available if people are interested. But today what I'm going to do is just talk an overview about what is in the plan. So one of the things that we determined that was really important if you're going to have a drought plan is that you monitor, you keep an eye on things so you know when you need to react. Things like the river flows, reservoir levels, how much rain did you get, or even how much moisture is in the soil. So these are all things that you have to keep an eye on so that you can know when time is there to react. Another component is called mitigation, and mitigation for us was looking at some more major capital projects. How could we back our plants up? How could we do things a little bit differently so we use less water? All kinds of different things there, so that if it came along, which it did, that the disaster was not as bad as it could have been, because we did some things to mitigate. We did some things to make it better and help ourselves. So there's a whole bunch of things to look at there. And then we've got response. So what do you do? How do you respond when you get hit with a drought? How do you respond when you get hit with a disaster? Some of these things are reapplicable for different kinds of upsets or different kinds of disasters. In this case, how do you get the water usage down, and how do you distribute it if there's less? And then something called preparedness. And this was something we did quite a bit of work on. And this is really like the mitigation, it's the big picture stuff, but the preparedness is a lot of little things to make sure it's not going to be as bad as it could have been. And finally, recovery. So I'm going to just take us through each of these a little bit more detail and show you some of the things we did to get ready and some of the things that we did to get our drought plan together. So you'll see on this one, I'm looking at the monitoring place, and you can see down the left-hand side, it says, well, this the first one is in Emerson, Red River at Emerson, which is right where the US border, Canadian border is. And then Stephenfield is our lake. So we'll just look at the one on the left here. And in one side, you've got daily stream flow indicators. So this is what's the flows, and you got normal, you got moderately dry, severe dry, and extreme dry. So depending on how much the flow rate is reduced, you end up with a indicator on that side. Now, across the top, there's something called preparedness. And I'll use an example. If you looked at, okay, you're severely dry, so you're down to 10%, much below normal. You go across to the right-hand side, and if you're highly prepared, then your overall impact could still be moderate. So by having having a lot less water, if you do a lot of things to prepare, it still might be moderate, not severe. Obviously, if you have a severe dry and you do no preparedness, then you're going to have either a severe or an extreme situation. So it's helpful to know when you're going to need to react. When are you going to need to do something? And so by coming up with these charts and being able to measure these things, it helped us know when to pull the trigger. When does the real drought show up, and when do we need to do actions? So let's just talk through a few of these and just some examples of what might be included. So mitigation. So remember, mitigation is making it better. Things like conservation, or how you get water down, getting additional water. Most of our water comes from surface runoff, but we do have one of our customers that gets a percentage of their water from an aquifer, so it's groundwater. And then desalination is an option, but it's real deep under the prairies and it's really salty. So that could be something that we did. Looking at partnerships, other utilities, other areas up along closer to Winnipeg, on other major rivers in the province. If we had a shortage, is there a way that we could somehow share water? And certainly having reservoirs where you store more water is a good idea. For us in this area, we seem to get a lot of water in the spring and not much in the fall. So the idea that you could put an impoundment, or you could put a pond or a reservoir where you could store water when there's lots of it in the spring, so you have it maybe in the fall when there isn't so much, is a good idea. Again, for us, because we're in the winter, we have to watch things around the ice. One of the issues is if the water level gets too low, then the whole river freezes. Right now, even at 40 below situation, there's water at the bottom of the river, and it's flowing quite well for us, and so we're okay. But that's because there's quite a level in the river. If the river gets very low, then everything freezes. There's no water, so that would be disastrous. So understanding how do you deal with ice, and then things like dams and weirs could increase your storage too. So that's a little bit on mitigation. Preparedness, as I said, is just a kind of a subset of that, but it's the little things. What can you do? And so as we got things, we said, well, there's some things we could do. We could learn from each other. We could make sure we got a good emergency plan. We could look better at how do we distribute water when there's reductions, when there's a need to reduce the amount of water. How do we get it out to people, and how do we do that? Where do we get emergency water at? Or even understanding water losses. Water losses is a big deal for all utilities. And so doing an assessment of your losses to understand what's your loss amount, and just losing less would help you in a drought situation. we've got the training, we've got this whole thing about new users, and then I'm going to talk a little bit later about our drought committee and our process. And finally, we're controlled by the Public Utilities Board in the province of Manitoba, and so we can't just jack up the price of water if there's a shortage to maybe cause people to pull back. We actually need the regulator to approve that for us. So let's move on then. So response. Okay, the drought comes. Well, what kind of a drought is it, and what's the response? And you can see this little chart we worked up. And in our case, say we use yellow, the severe drought. So we're going to call for a 10 to 25% reduction in water usage across the board. And we're going to ask each of the municipalities to pull that are, what we do is the PVWC wholesales the information to the municipalities. And so, or the water to the municipalities. So when we go into a drought stage, we're going to say to each municipality, cut back your total water coming to your municipality by somewhere between 10 and 25%. And then they have to go to the domestic users, and they have to go to the industrials and the ag users, and they have to pull them back by 25%. So this was something that, okay, when we're going to respond, this is going to be what we need to do. Now, in terms of actions, our process kind of looks like the first thing that happens when we're in responding is that the Manitoba government tells PVWC, because the Manitoba government has got really good data, and they monitor flows and they monitor all kinds of things. So they can say, oh, the data says we're getting in drought stage. And then the next thing, well, we're going to get together with them and we're going to go through that drought data. And then if we think an action has to be taken, we convene our actual drought committee, which is more operational folks, and say, well, what are we going to do? And with that, we review the data. And then the PVWC board of directors is one representative from each of the 14 municipalities or each of the 14 councils. And so then the board actually declares a drought state of emergency on behalf of the 14 municipalities across southern Manitoba. So that's kind of how it is. Now here's a little bit of a diagram to try to explain it, but it's kind of busy. Over on the left-hand side here is, okay, normally we're just going along with us in the Manitoba government. We're monitoring a normal situation on the left side. Then we have a drought committee, we have a board, and then we have an internal day-to-day managing the drought committee. And so there's back and forths here. We've got internal communication and external communication. And typically the way it's worked with us in the 14 municipalities is if there's an issue, a disaster with one municipality, the municipality will do the communication with the communities and the press. But if it's something involving all 14, then it comes back to Pembina Valley Water Co-op to do the communication to everybody. So just continue along here and talk a little bit more about response, and then we'll get into some more interesting stuff here. So we have these little charts worked up for each of those colors. So for normal, from severe, extreme, there's a chart that speaks to the different activities that have to be going on. And you can see in here, like for instance, the drought committee meets annually. So this, we get the 14 municipalities together and we say, how's it going? And as long as we're not doing droughts management, then it's just the other thing that happens here, you can see we put out a monitoring report every week, so everybody just watches it. So there's certain things that have to happen when you're in normal conditions, just so that you kind of pay attention. Now, the last stage, and this is happening in any disaster, is a recovery. And it's a little bit different with droughts than some of the other disasters, because some disasters come and then they're, over in a week, in a month, it's over. For us in the Pembina Valley, in the Red River, we have floods too. So when we have a flood, we had one a little while ago. And so for 35 days, the main road was blocked. The water level was high, but then the water went down and we're all done. Droughts go from 2 to 6 months. So it's a little bit more difficult when you're trying to deal with a recovery because it doesn't come back very quickly. So your recovery could be when you go back to normal, or it could be when you maybe go to moderate. So you start implementing some recovery, even though it's not fully recovered because it takes so long to recover. You can see the kind of things you look at. You kind of look at, well, how did our mitigation work? Um, our monitoring, did we were measuring the right things, the right triggers? What about budgets? How did this work out when we reduced the amount of water we were selling and we had the same expenses for our utility? How did that work out? And we weren't allowed to increase the price. So this whole thing, when you're recovering, you want to look at these different things from both a resource and a financial perspective, and you say, okay, let's ramp up. Let's end up getting through this, and we'll go from there. So then the last, what we call implementation. And I'm going to just quickly go through these 12 things, and then we'll get into a real drought. And implementation was, it was the things we did after we had a nice document together, the things we did over the next year to make sure it was all going to work. And it was a bit of a learning for us because we didn't realize it was going to take quite as long, but we were trying to get 14 different municipal jurisdictions to all align and move along. So the first thing we want is local drought plans. So we ended up with a wonderful drought plan that belonged to Pembina Valley Water Co-op, owned by the 14 municipalities, but we now need individual plans for each of the municipalities, whether it be a town, city, or a rural area. In some jurisdictions, they needed to develop water conservation bylaws because in the towns and some of the areas, if someone doesn't do what they're supposed to, it's a violation of the bylaws. So obviously the bylaws would be needed to be created in order to do that. And then the last one there was the Public Utilities Board. Going back, and what did we learn about that? So then moving along, we've got monitoring. Well, we got the non-drought times, but then the other drought, we've got these different reports. I'm going to talk to that a little bit, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. But there's the US and the Canadian Drought Monitor. They're regulatory agencies that provide drought numbers and also forecasting. And so this whole idea, do we need to do anything different in terms of what we monitor? And then we have an approval process to add new users. What we found was that in some cases, people were wanting to hook onto our big lines. And we really don't want them to do that. So we'd rather them hook onto the municipal lines, the smaller lines. And that causes us pressure and flow issues. And we have to maintain 20 PSI, or we end up having to call a boil water advisory according to regulators in Manitoba. So just this whole approval about who gets added on and where do they get added on and how does that impact us? The whole forecasting thing, PVWC came up with a whole process where we provide information to each of the municipalities on their usage, and then we ask for their forecast usage for the next number of years. We have a water modeling approach that we work with one of our local engineering firms, and we actually forecast the water needs requirements for the next 5, 10, and 15 and 20 years. And then we drop that into computer programs and we can figure out when would we have to add additional booster stations, when would we have to twin lines, when would we have to do all kinds of things or install new lines because of increased flow requirements and losses. So this whole thing about better understanding with each of the municipalities what their needs were, this is pretty darn important to us. And then this whole, well, where's new water sources? Can we get tied into an aquifer? Can we get tied into somebody else that has other water so that we might need it if we get in trouble? So we started exploring a lot of those kind of things. And then this ag thing. And I mentioned it at the start, but for us, dependency on the ag sector is absolutely huge. And I'll give you an example. I talked about that spraying for weed control. Um, we have 9 rural municipalities. 6% of their whole water for the whole year for the 9 municipalities goes out just to spray for weed control. So it's just a massive amount of water that's going into that. Another example, in one municipality, they have 40 hog barns. 21 of them are connected to us. So hogs, yes, pigs. And in 2 municipalities, 25% of their water usage for the whole year goes to hog barns. So you think, well, that's quite a bit. And then I'll just give you one more example. We provide water. We just increased the water availability from 9 liters a second to 12 liters a second. So we had a 25% increase for a large canola processing plant in southern Manitoba. And that allowed them to increase the gate revenue to the producers, the farmers in southern Manitoba. Currently, they were paying about 800 million to the farmers for their crops, and now they're going to pay $1 billion to the farmers for their crops. So this is big business, this ag sector water, and it's pretty unique for us in the prairies. People don't normally have to deal with those things when they think of potable water. They think of more, it's the people that drink the water and need the water for domestic use. But we have this other thing about water that's really kind of a little bit unusual for us. And then just wrapping up on this, amendments to the PVWC drought plan. What we realized was we also have disasters, right? Everybody does in the utilities. You know, you have a pipeline that busts. You have we have freeze-thaw cycles. I'm not sure what happens in the Caribbean, but or we have pipelines that didn't take when we put it together properly. And so we have failures that occur over time. And so we have a disaster, we have to react to it in a certain municipality or in a certain leg on our pipelines. And so we have learnings about disaster management and how we do that. And we learned that that's a good thing to dial that into your drought plan. Of course, updating the emergency plan. Everybody has an emergency plan. There's some learnings and training the emergency management organization, training on that. And finally, longer term things that we all know we need to do, but sometimes it takes a little bit to get into them. And that was the tabletop exercises, the practice, looking at hazard analysis to see what the risk is, looking at demand management. What do the customers really need the water for, and how much do they need as they go forward? And then finally, just standardizing on formats. So these are little things. So as we wrapped up the drought planning effort, we had a few learnings. One, and you can see a provincial drought strategy is good, foundation, and you see the little booklet at the top there. That was the provincial drought strategy, and it gave us some benchmarks, some direction from the provincial government, and that was helpful. We used external facilitation. We did something kind of interesting. We hired an engineering firm to help us define the issues and stuff at the start. And then we hired a municipal planning firm to help us with the development of the plan and the implementation, because they were used to implementing things within the municipalities around roads or subdivisions or those kind of things. And so we found them very helpful. The other thing was involvement of the provincial regulators and EMO. And then we're down to these key things: the monitoring, the mitigation, the response, the preparedness, and the recovery. Those same things, whether you're dealing with a flood, whether you're dealing with a hurricane, whether you're dealing with a drought, it's all important. And so that was where we ended up. And just to close off then, on this part of the presentation and move to the second, the drought plan was finalized in 2018. You can see me sitting there at my desk with the document, real happy. We got a drought plan. We put it all together and we did the implementation. So that was those last 12 steps in the last go here. Got a good document. We had a good process. And then What happened? Huh. In 2021, we had a drought. So you can
Do you
look
want
at
to take a
pictures
question
here.
now, Greg? There's a question. Do you want
Okay,
to take, because
sure.
it may be on the first part. It might be a good time just to.
Yeah, sure. Let's stop. Questions. Go ahead, unmute yourself and ask it. Oh, it's up in the chat. How often do you have a boil water advisory? Oh, isn't that a good question? So a few years ago, we might have a couple a year, 2 or 3. And then we've probably spent 40 million in capital over the last 5 years. And every time we hook up new pipelines or a new part of the plant, it's caused us to have a boil water advisory. So we went from probably having 1 or 2 to maybe having 4 or 5. And now that those changes have been made, we're in a better place. We've gone around doing some isolations between us and the municipalities, and we have the ability to feed water from different plants in different jurisdictions. So sometimes we can isolate an area and only have the boil water in a very small part, 1 or 2 municipalities, and then we can feed the water all the way around everybody else, so we don't have to put them into boil water from one of our water treatment plants. So we're getting pretty good at that. We've upped the productions at the plants so that we have more capacity. And in some cases, we put booster stations with that boost in 2 directions. So we can boost in one direction if we need, or we can turn around if the plant goes down and we can boost in the other direction from reservoirs. Does that help? That answer? Other questions on the process? It's good, Valerie's point. We're stopped here at you see what we did. We're going to go into what happened now. And we had a pretty good disaster going here. I don't see any more hands. Okay, well, we can wait till the end. And if we can come back and people have questions. So remember in 18, we got the nice plan together. In 19, we got it all together. And then in 2021, drought hit the Red River Valley. And you can see the picture of the river in the middle. That's called the Roseau River. And that feeds into the Red River. And it is dry. The picture on the far left is the Red River. So you're standing looking at one direction, and when you look down at the river, you can almost step across that. If you looked at all these people standing there, that's me with a big guy with the hand stretched out, and I got a local MLA, I got a cabinet minister, and I got 2 mayors standing behind me. And we're all down at the river saying, what are we gonna do? This is a big deal for Southern Manitoba. And so we had at the time we were still doing the COVID things. And so we had online stuff. So on July 27th, the PVWC and its 14-member municipalities declared a drought state of emergency. You can see in the document above, this is one of the production things that comes out of the Canadian and the US Drought Monitor. And you can see all these red and yellow saying we haven't had drought. And they categorized it as to what they would call a D3, an extreme drought, a 20 to 50-year event. And they also went on to say that they expected this to continue to September. So this is in July, the end of July, and we've been watching it going down. And well, why is this a problem? Well, the levels are getting low, and there's been significant reductions, and they're telling us this thing is going to continue. Well, at the rate it was going, the whole river would dry up by the end of September. And so then what do we do? And even if it doesn't dry up, if the level becomes too low, then water doesn't pass under, then we have no water and everything freezes. So it was a very tense situation. this is kind of the numbers of what was going on at the time. We went from the middle of June to the middle of July, and we went from 1532 CPS, cubic feet per second, to 752. So it dropped in half. River went down 20 inches. Stephenville dropped 20 inches. And then the week before this meeting, it dropped a foot in 1 week. And then the Letellier plant, the intake, where we pull the water out of the river, it got above the water level. And it reduced then we had no head to be able to pull the water out of the river. So we had to pull in temporary diesel pumps and temporary intakes just to get water out of the river, because now the river has gone down so low that there's no head, there's not enough. Yeah, there's some water in the river, but there's not enough level there for us to make the pumps and the intake work. And then at our Morris plant, we had the same thing going on. So this is the plan that came out of that meeting on the 27th. Coordinate regionally. We're all in this together for the water shortage. First thing, we declared a severe state of emergency requiring a 15% reduction. We started to look at how can we store water, because there's water going by yet. It's going up from the south to the north, going past our plants, and it's going into Hudson Bay and into the Arctic Ocean. So if we could gather some of it, what we realized was our Letellier plant had a pond we could store a month and a half. Our Morris had a big pond we could store 6 months. We started looking at this Winkler Morden, which were two of our municipalities, one fed from an aquifer and one fed from a lake. So we did a portion of their water. Well, we said, let's maximize our flow to them. We'll save the aquifer and we'll save the lake. And when the Red River goes dry, then they'll feed us back to our other customers. So that was something we'd look at. We looked at other places to store water. We looked at other sources in the province. We got into gravel pits and creeks and ponds and rain barrels. How do you use other sources of water so that you don't need to use your precious potable on those things? In the end, the key message was, this is a serious situation. Yeah, we'd like a month-long rain to make it all go away. But the reality is we needed the community, we need the ag sector, we need businesses to proactively respond and support us so that we can deal with the long-term issues of water in southern Manitoba. So we have the drought. So here's an example of one of our useless intakes. It's sitting on top of the water. So obviously you're not going to pull water out of it. It's got no ability to develop a head for the pumps to work. On the right-hand side, you can see temporary diesels. It looks like there's quite a bit of water in that one spot behind, and there is, but it's only less than a foot. And it's just one little pool. And so we had these diesels that we had to install so that we could make things work, and temporary pipelines and temporaries. Then we got into more. So we're into direct response and mitigation here. You can see we pulled a new line, we buried a new line running from a wet well at Morris to the river, and then we put a new temporary intake in the river at Morris. The second picture here is at Letellier. We dug down and tied a new pipeline, which is the one on the right-hand side here by the diesels, coming up over the hill and then tying into our existing pipelines and new valves so we could make this all work. And with the idea that when we're all said and done, we could switch back easy to the existing system if the drought ever went away. And then on the right-hand side, I think you can appreciate that we've got these diesel pumps down by the river, and this is very labor intensive, fueling them all the time to keep this going. So we started looking at putting in an electric. So that's what you're seeing here is an electric pump, electric motor. We had power poles, we had transformers, all this kind of stuff to get this going. So what's happening with our response and mitigation? We've gone from 1,200 CFS to 347. We just watched the water levels go down. We're meeting every day online from July to September. All hands on deck. We're managing gravel pits for weed control. We had 6 different gravel pits across southern Manitoba and this picture at the top is actually a gravel pit that had a whole bunch of water in it. So we're diverting all of the folks from the ag sector to the gravel pits, and we were maintaining it. We did something really creative. We partnered with Manitoba Infrastructure, which is the guys that do the flood forecasting and flood data, and we did a reverse analysis on the water levels on the Red River, and we're able to figure out as it stopped flowing, when would it get, as it was reduced, when would it get to the point, what was the high level in the river coming south to north, and when would it stop flowing? It was extremely helpful to figure that out and go backwards. We did a bathymetric study on the Red from Morris, which is about halfway from Winnipeg to the US border, and figured out, is there some deeper spots where we could operate? And finally, we did this analysis. You can see the graph here on the right-hand side. Well, we hired this consulting firm to look at trends. How long could we store? How long could we operate? And then you can see this graphs, and the government had them way back to the dirty 30s, which is this picture when the river went dry the last time. And you can see from the bottom of the 2 troughs, from no flow to no flow, it was approximately 6 months. And it looked like with the work we were doing, we could maybe make this work for 6 months. So as I said, we're filling the electricals and diesels, we're doing the gravel pit, we're maximizing the water to a few jurisdictions to help feed back. We got into rain barrels in a big way. Municipalities had rain barrels to their constituents. People said, and the municipalities found ways to have water trucks take it from creeks and go around and fill people's rain barrels so they could maintain their vegetable gardens and their flower gardens. And then lastly, we had to give extra water for beef and pork production. In one case, 20% of the milk production for the province came from an area, and we had to find water for them. We could not have the water for the cattle, and we could not have the water for the pork. And then it rained. Here it is, October. You can see this picture, the Red River at the 201 bridge. 27th, you can see, you can just about, on the left, you can just about walk across it. On the right, this is October. Now, on the far right, you can see things are all bundled up here. This was the electric motor, and this was the temporary intake into the water. We thought we were going to go into the winter with this thing. So we're trying to get ready to see how we can run temporaries through up to more -40-degree weather. And so we were insulating and tying in everything. We were so happy when the rain came at the end of October. So what did we learn from this? Well, we learned about communication and cooperation being real important. We probably, because we had 14 municipalities, we probably had too many people in the decision making, but we'll do better next time. We learned about long-term planning and infrastructure, the need to have water capacity, and also the need to do better on your conservation. On decision making, we learned that we just should have the ops guys help with the recommendations and then have the board do the political approvals. That would be better. And with relationships, we learned that continue to do all the things we were doing and maybe partner a little bit more with the Army Corps, because the same drought was going on the other side of the border. And finally, this whole idea about reductions, we learned that we can't do this 15 to 25% maybe for the cattle, because it would impact milk production or beef sales or whatever. So we had to be a little bit careful there. So part of it I mentioned on the US side was we have an organization called the Red River Basin Commission. So when we finished this, we went through an exercise of what did we learn both on the US and the Canadian side, with representatives from Manitoba, from North Dakota, and from Minnesota. And we came up with what we called the Water Supply Working Group Preparedness Checklist for drought mitigation. So it's a little bit of a checklist of are we ready for a drought in the future? And I'm not going through all the details, but I will hit the overview. One was community, one was existing water systems, one's water demand and forecast, one is monitoring conditions, and finally conservation, response plan, and recovery. So what does this say? Be prepared. Why? Because in 2021, we had a drought. See what happened in 2022. This is the middle picture, or on the left-hand side is the Morris town, totally surrounded by water. You can see the water going through. This is the river that's outgrown its banks. You can see our little booster station there. And then over on the green picture where the green field, you can see our booster station. So it just goes to show that we had a drought in 2021. We had a flood in 2022. We're back to this in 2023. And now you can see some tracking of data. The diagram on the top there, red, we had a bad situation in February, and now in February 22nd, and now on 29th, it's changed. So the bottom line is we need to be prepared. And I think we were. Thank you for your attention. And now we'll open it for questions or comments. Anybody out there?
Right. Thank you, Greg. I'm right here. I'm just searching through the chat box to see if there are any questions. I haven't seen any hands up just yet, but I think that was a pretty interesting presentation. Of course, we are familiar with droughts, and this period of the year is the drought period for us, although I think we are getting some rainfall at this stage. You presented in one of your earlier slides, you spoke about the request for reduction in consumption, and you had different stages where I think one of the stages where you would have to ask the consumers to reduce consumption by between 10 and 25%. How successful does this work in your part of the world in terms of the response to such a request?
Well, it was actually pretty successful because we were in dire straits, and the municipalities took it very seriously. They actually had people driving around. They were monitoring the daily flows, and they had places where they would have filling stations for the ag sector, and they were monitoring all the water usages. And, you know, there was on the radio. It was pretty, it was actually, the reductions were so good that we were able to fund a little bit of extra water for the ag sector with the cattle and the cattle on the dairy section and the beef, because we gave them more water than they were supposed to, but we did so well in everything else. Like, the community really came on board on this. Let's get off the potable water. We won't do our gardens. We won't do our flower gardens. We won't do our vegetable gardens. At least half, maybe 3/4 of the municipalities had water trucks driving around their communities, filling up barrels out in front of people's houses so we could get the water usage down. So people really, that big canola processing plant that I spoke to, they cut production by 25%. They literally lost millions of dollars to be able to support the initiative that we were doing. So we were in dire straits, and people knew it, and I appreciated the support.
All right, Greg, we have a question in the chat which says, what was the final decision with regards to reducing flows % to the agri section of 15 to 25% was not feasible?
There was just 2 jurisdictions. One was the RM of Gray, where they had the cattle, and I let them continue to do, they did some reductions. They had some gravel pit stuff. they weren't down, they were down like 5% or something like that. And then there was another rural co-op where they were actually up 10%, and they had all these cattle, but all the dugouts were dry, and they would have had to either slaughter the cows or whatever. And so we kind of let them do it. In all the other jurisdictions, we did really well. Some went to 25%, some went to 15%, but they were all in the range of 15 to 25.
Next question in the chat says, what problems, if any, did you encounter when storing water in barrels, tanks, and other containers? For example, bacterial growth.
So the other places, well, we had the water, we went around and we identified 6 large gravel pits, and there was quite a bit of water there. Some of the issues, there was one gravel pit that had good, what would you call it? There's certain manganese and other things that impact the spraying and the herbicides. And so there was some of the gravel pits that that had too much manganese or too much minerals in there. And so it didn't work well for the farmers when we were asking them to use it. From a bacteria point, the water was being used so fast. Most of the lake stuff was low. There was some green stuff in a few responses, but they were trying to use the water in places where if there was a little bit of bacteria growth, it wasn't significant, so it didn't cause trouble. So the rain barrels, it just came in and out. They just kept driving around towns and driving around the municipalities with the trucks, and people would use it up and water their flowers and water their vegetable gardens.
Okay, another question here. Any consideration given to reuse of water from wastewater effluents from the wastewater treatment plants to help mitigate the situation during the drought?
Yep. We had 2 jurisdictions, both Altona and Winkler, that went after the provincial government, and they would not support the initiative in the middle of the drought. So they are continuing to work on it now. And I think at some point in time, we will get something where we start to do that. We start to do secondary treatment and more of a primary treatment on the effluent so we can use it back in the system. We were going to try to do it in phases. Can you just let us use the water and we'll get it clean enough that we could do it for some of the other potable water usages? So maybe not for drinking water for humans, but could we use it for some other things? And so I think there's still efforts ongoing to do that.
I have a question, Greg.
Sure.
You reduced 15% or more over the board. What did that do to your revenues, and how did you manage your revenues?
It hurt us, but we weren't doing some of the things, when you're all hands on deck. I got my CFO out filling pumps at gravel pits. I don't have anybody in the office doing anything. I don't have anybody on vacation. I don't have anybody doing any training. Everybody's just working all hands on deck. So I didn't have any extra spending. It cost me $800,000 more than I had in the budget, but I canceled a bunch of capital project work that we were going to do because we didn't have time to do it anyway, because we were in the midst of a drought. So I was able to meet my budget, which is important in Manitoba because there's a law that I can't go negative in a municipal entity. So, and the disappointing part was Manitoba and Canada has some great funding programs for floods. They have no funding programs, either Manitoba or Canada, for droughts. So I had to eat the $800,000. But we did some work after the fact and went talk to the Public Utilities Board, and there's work going on right now to put through a proposal that they would approve, so that the minute you declare drought, where the province agrees, you can automatically raise the rates for the water so you can recover your money, because the revenues at utilities, as everybody knows, is dependent on your sales. And so you need water sales. And when you have to turn around and want to reduce it, yeah, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot there. So it can be difficult.
The other thing I was going to ask you is a little bit off topic, but one of the things I remember you telling me about on an economic situation with your hydroponics that were going to go in and the lack of water. And I think it might just be interesting to just relate that story to the people. It's not necessarily, well, I guess it's to do with lack of water, but not so much necessarily drought, but
well, there's water in a couple of cases. One, it can be with greenhouses and what they need for water to be able to grow, which I think is maybe what you're thinking about. But we had
you
two
told me
cases.
about that there was going to be a whole economic project going in, and they hadn't talked to your utility about whether you had the water, and they had to cancel the thing. So I thought
well,
this
was a ag processing, a secondary processing of oat in the ag sector, where they needed 21 liters a second, and I could give them 7. And this is an internal thing with the government not being very open to collaborating on these things. And we're still working on that in Manitoba, and the guy that replaced me as the CEO is still working on that. When we were in the drought, we felt a lot of pressure from some of the larger industrial things. There's a couple of large pork processors in Canada, Maple Leaf, and a couple other ones that owned a lot of these hog barns. And when we suggested we'll shut down the hog barns, we got quite a bit of feedback from the government that you're not shutting down the hog barns. Well, you better figure out a way to help us find water to feed the pigs then. Because and so the economic impact is significant when the drought happens, and the potential economic impact if you provide more water for ag development is huge. Other questions, comments?
Floor is open, colleagues.
Don't be
Well,
shy. If you're wondering something, just take your thing off of mute so you don't have to type and just ask the question. It wasn't much fun. I had no life from June to December, and we didn't put those pumps back to the rental until middle of December, and we pulled them out in June, and it was all hands on deck, and you're not doing anything else. And we were really worried that the level was going to keep going down. We weren't going to get that rain in October, and we're going to have no water flowing there.
Greg, in the Caribbean, we have of course, in some countries, you have the water resource management agencies that would monitor stream flows, etc., and try to predict drought, along with the support of the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. You mentioned that you do have your managers or the utility had impeccable data to be able to treat with the drought situation, or to give to the drought committee. What is the source of that information?
So there's an agency in Manitoba, and they've been keeping track of the data. The data is in 2 places. The federal government has flow monitoring on most of the major rivers and lakes in the province, and Manitoba Hydro, who has extensive hydroelectric generation in Manitoba, also has measurement. So between the Manitoba government, or the federal government measurement, and the Manitoba Hydro measurement, we have extremely good data. And so to the point where I would actually click on every morning, I clicked on the measurement of the flows at Emerson on the Red River, and I could see it, what was happening. And they had technicians down there to make sure that the devices were operating properly and everything. And that was what allowed them to make that curve that I showed you with the red, those two spots where they dipped down in the 30s. And so we were saying, well, we think if we could do 6 months, we could make it. But the only thing is that the weather seems a little more unpredictable around the world today. And so you don't know. Like we didn't know we were going to get a rain in October. We thought maybe we weren't going to get it for 6 months. And that's but having the data is wonderful. It really is.
I think, Ignatius, this is a topic that has really hit with our audience, because it seems to me, I may be wrong, but this is one of the larger audiences that we've had on a seminar, and a lot of quite a number of questions. So I think it is very topical. And as I said, Greg is part of Operators Without Borders. So if anybody in a municipality or a utility wants to have a bit of help or talk to Greg, we're more than happy to do that.
Yeah, and we've got a very detailed, oh, I see another question. Are there PM schedules on the pumps used, especially the diesel during low level intakes? Yes. I had a summer engineering student. I had him hired to do some other things, but we created a checklist with everything, and he had to go around every morning. He had a loop. He spent the whole day going between pumps with the different gravel pits, and he updated those. The important ones, that was for water for the ag sector. The really important pumps were the ones that our water treatment plant operators maintained at the two locations on the red. And the guys spent a lot of time there, because you've got to make sure they're fueled until we went to electrical. You know, you're looking at all kinds of different things. There's little filters on there. We were not in a place where we could afford for them to go down. And so we had to watch that every day. And we were quite concerned when we were going into the winter, because it gets so cold. But what's going to happen with some of this equipment? And that's why we were starting to put insulation around the electrics. And that's why we went from diesel to electric, to try to help ourselves, because it was, you know, having to have the fuel trucks down there all the time and filling. It just took a lot of time for our operators. Operators were spending time at the river all the time. And it was just sucking them away from the other things that they should be and needed to be doing at the water treatment plants.
There's a question here by Mr. Lacan, who's Lao Chan. Can we get a copy of the e-document? I believe it was the drought plan Mr. Greg said was available. And the other
Yes.
one was, are there PM schedules on the pumps used, especially the diesel during the low level intakes in the drought?
That last one he just answered.
Oh, that was the one.
That was, yes, that was the one he just answered.
Yeah, the PMs, they weren't very detailed. They were just, okay, it needs to be fueled. You need to check the pressures. You need to check the oil. It was really basic stuff. And what we found was, yeah, there was some problems with the reliability of the pumps. Like they weren't brand new pumps or anything. So for us, it was, we had to touch the pump every day, Saturdays and Sundays. We had to have someone go by every day and make sure they were fueled, and make sure they just checked to see that pressures were right, temperatures were right, those basic things. So,
all right.
And the rental agency gave us a little bit of a checklist, but it was more, if you rent them, check these things. So,
well,
the actual drought plan is available electronically as a PDF. So Ignatius, I will send you, I sent you the PDF of this presentation. I will send you the PDF of the whole drought plan. And I'm certainly available if anybody wants to do more work on it or wants to understand it. There's a lot more detail in the document, but it was a good thing for us. It really helped us. And, you know, I'm really glad we did all that to get ready because we got hit pretty hard and it really helped us.
Well, sure. We will circulate the recording of this webinar as well as any other information that you should send me. I will send them to all the participants, and we will also post it on our website. Of course, Greg, we would like to thank you immensely for this presentation this afternoon. And we think our numbers are getting better as we progress with our webinars this year. I would like to welcome those who joined us for the first time this year, and well, to encourage you to get your other colleagues at your workplaces, your various workplaces, to join us on a Wednesday for the Wednesday webinar. Unfortunately, next Wednesday, we will not be hosting a webinar, but the following one, that would be the week of on the 20th, we will be back. That is owing to some unforeseen circumstances. We, of course, in summary, one of the critical things that Greg said was that we need to be prepared. And we live in an environment, and particularly in our Caribbean region, at this time of the year, we need to be prepared. We need to monitor what is being, all the information given to us by the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology and various Met offices in our various jurisdictions, and all the other, and of course, the monitoring and forecasting of droughts. So that's all part of the preparedness, and that the utilities, we all need to have our various preparedness plans and response planning so that we are not caught off guard. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I'm Ignatius Jean, the Executive Director at the Caribbean Water and Sewage Association. Today's presenter was Mr. Greg Archibald, former CEO of Pembina Valley Water Cooperative. And of course, we are supported by the Operators Without Borders and Valerie Jenkinson in making this happen. Thank you very much. We will sign off, and I will circulate the recording to you very shortly. Have a good evening, all. Bye.
Ignatius?
Good evening.